Today my guest is Martyn Potts. Martyn was born in Blackpool and spent his early family years in Padiham and Lancaster before his family moved to the Wirral in 1959. He's lived in the Heatons for 40 years and before retiring in 2010 followed a successful career as an English teacher. He's later become well known in the Heatons for writing poetry which he publishes on a variety of platforms, and his recent books include Now and Then, Poems of Memory and Reflection, Crossing the River, Recollections of Childhood Days on Merseyside, and Chocolate Buffoons and Other Poems, inspired by the challenges we've all had to face during lockdown. Martyn, welcome. I think it's fair to say that although your books are all recent publications, you're not new to writing poetry.
No, I'm not new, but as you probably know, Phil, when you're doing a full-time teaching job, there isn't all that much time for personal reflection and writing. But I did find myself during my teaching years writing the odd poem. What I'd do, for instance, was every class I took, at the end of the year, I used to write a humorous poem about class characters, and I'd try and link in books that we'd read, just to focus them on the fact that poetry can be every day, because it's one of those aspects of English that, never mind the kids themselves, some English teachers I've come across are terrified of teaching poetry because they see it as something complicated. And then from there, when I was a younger teacher and you were, shall we say, not always in favour of senior management decisions, I used to write an annual poem for the staff review, and I did one very early on in that kind of period. We had a Welsh head teacher who loved Dylan Thomas, and I did a parody of Under Milkwood, which went down quite well, so that became an annual thing. And then from there it went to, birthdays, Phil, people reaching 50, as it used to be, 60, and I'd write birthday poems in celebration. And then some friends of mine actually gave me a commission. They asked me to write a poem for their daughter's wedding because I'd known her since she was a little girl, and it just kind of developed from there. And then when I retired, I just found I had more time to write, and again, possibly like yourself, you're looking for something to do. And for me, poetry's great because poems are short. It's not a huge commitment like trying to write a novel, and you can get a thought, walking the dog or 3 o'clock in the morning, and you've got the beginnings of a poem, so you don't need some huge, great structure to follow. So that's how I kind of got into it, and just with more time and more space to think, it's just seemed to come naturally.
The poems in your first book, Now and Then, move across different periods in your life, but there are some clear recollections of early family life back in the 1950s. It deals with strong memories and emotions. Was that a happy time for you?
It was a very happy time, but questions like that are sometimes difficult. I'm trying, I hope, not to say it was necessarily better, because some things clearly weren't, but it was different. And I think one of the things that occurred to me, just reflecting about modern life, and then was certainly kids where I lived had a degree of freedom that I don't think a lot of children now have. And I don't just mean freedom of movement, I mean probably freedom from anxiety, because our parents, certainly my parents, were just relieved that the war was over, and they lived through that, so that anything that could happen in peacetime seemed by comparison not too difficult. And there was no pressure through social media and that kind of thing, because it didn't exist. Even telly wasn't on till children's hour. You got an hour of children's TV, and that was it. So people from my background lived in tiny houses, so you're outdoors all the time, because actually there was nothing to stay in the house for. So we had a kind of freedom, and I enjoyed that freedom living where we did, close to an urban area, but also close to a rural area where you could go exploring and you could do as you want. And I'm aware that not everybody had it easy. There were difficulties. I'm sure that there was poverty, but we were kind of aspiring working class. My dad was never out of work because he worked for a nationalised central electricity generating board, so employment was secure, and that, I think, that kind of transfers through to children. If your parents are fairly relaxed and you don't expect too many grand gestures in terms of new bikes and new whatevers, then life is happy.
In the introduction to Now and Then, your second book, you talk about the influence French writer Michel de Montaigne had on you, in that his belief was to look inwards on himself rather than outwards to the world. You took this philosophy into your poems. Was it an easy thing to do?
It was in a way, because when he made that kind of switch, it doesn't sound like anything too important, looking inwards rather than outwards, but it was, because thought before him had largely focused on this life being a preparation for the afterlife. And it was almost heresy for him to talk about this being our one and only life, so make the most of it and look inwards. He almost anticipated that modern sense of living in the moment, and that struck me when I've read him, but I've also read an excellent introduction to him by an English academic called Sarah Bakewell, and all he did was look at very small things, well, some things that were more abstract, like friendship, but just on making journeys, on spring days. He even wrote an essay on farting, which is very Monty Python, isn't it? And it seems more natural to us, but what he did was give a sense of kind of validation to that. And one of the poems that I wrote, called Michel de Montaigne's Cat, he had this moment while he was writing with his quill. I can just hear the sound, dipping it in ink, when his cat was showing some curiosity and moving its paw at the sound of, and he suddenly thought to himself, why can't my cat look at me with the same sense of curiosity that I look at him? Because humans aren't the only life on earth. And again, even that was almost heretical, because in the accepted beliefs of the time, man was at the centre of all human life, all life on earth, which was there to serve his needs, rather than this more modern sense of us being one creature on a planet living with all these other creatures who have an equal right to live and be curious. And that's why he appealed to me in a way.
I'm sure a lot of Heaton's residents with cats will probably agree with you that cats can look at you in a particular way.
Yes, disdainfully, I think is the word you're looking for. Yes.
Yeah. I enjoyed Crossing the River, perhaps the most of your books, because I grew up not far from the areas that you talk about. What I was amazed at was the detail in the poems, the details of your memory, really. Did you find it easy to look back and recall those details from your childhood days?
I did, really, but I suppose, well, a couple of things really. One, I've always had a pretty good memory, but we moved around a lot. So I did a couple of years in Blackpool, a couple of years in Padiham near Burnley, I think 5 years in Lancaster. And I think when you move, it's easy to associate place with event. If I'd spent all that time in one place, you'd have more difficulty separating things. And the other thing about it was that, and I think I say this in the introduction to the book, I didn't realise at the time, no more than anyone else, that decade from 59 to 69 when I lived there was probably the most important modern decade in Liverpool's history, because suddenly, after the Beatles, it became the centre of the creative universe, and it was this unbelievably vibrant place. And that memory that I talk about of going over on the ferry boat and seeing that skyline of the big city, even the people of Liverpool don't see that because they live there, but we were approaching from the Wirral over the water, as they say, not proper Scousers. And it had that sense of excitement. So the other thing that happens is once you start recalling, other things click into place. Or I've talked to the odd old school friend who's got in touch because of the poetry, and they remind you of something. And sometimes it's small details, like going to be measured for my first suit with my dad, that it's not that big a deal, but on reflection, that was a rite of passage. In fact, it's the only made-to-measure suit I've ever had in my life, because you could do it in those days. It wasn't enormously expensive. So, yes, in answer to the question, I didn't find it difficult, but it was a kind of cumulative process. Like once you start remembering, that somehow opens some memory gates and other things flood in.
Your most recent book, Chocolate Buffoons and Other Poems, deals with the way the pandemic has been managed by the government, and some listeners will have followed you on Facebook where you've regularly posted these poems. I've enjoyed them very much indeed. Many of them are quite angry and critical about how the situation has been managed. What responses have you had from people who've read these poems?
Well, I suppose this is the modern indication of living in an echo chamber, isn't it, Phil? Nothing negative as yet, but I suspect nobody who voted for Boris or Brexit ever reads my poems. Maybe I'm inviting disaster by even saying this, but the responses have been almost universally positive, but in the sense that, and this is the intention really, I'm just expressing in verse, in a compacted way, what people feel, because I'm sure lots and lots of people watched those early press briefings thinking, you are joking, every time Boris comes out with one of his jokes that's just inappropriate, or they quite clearly don't know the answer to a question but blunder through, or more recently, refuse to take any blame for a situation that has clearly been created by a degree of government ineptitude, and then try and take all the credit for a vaccine that's been produced by dedicated scientists. That just made me angry. And, rather than go out and do acts of violence, I'd rather commit my thoughts to words, and in the hope that it might resonate with some of the people. So I'm a very mild-mannered, peaceable chap, but the verse gives an opportunity to let off some spleen, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose you could argue that all the best poets do actually create perhaps a degree of controversy with their writing, and not everybody's going to agree with the philosophies that are expressed in them.
Yeah.
I mean, you've lived in the Heatons now for quite a while. Have you ever written any poems inspired by this place?
Not directly, I wouldn't say, but some of the more recent stuff that I've written since lockdown ended, I suppose I've become aware of, the passing of the seasons a little bit more, with a more heightened sense. And the fact that we live in this lovely, leafy, tree-lined suburb helps, because in the front of our garden is a copper beech, and it's a barometer of the seasons. The first thing in the morning when you raise the blind, the state of that tree is a clear indication of what season you're in and what the weather's like. And I'm very conscious walking the dog around Heaton Moor of living in this lovely environment, and that in itself helps the writing. But I haven't done anything directly about living in the Heatons, no. Maybe that will come.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've already started on your next venture. Yeah. I was going to ask you what that was, and in fact you're going to read us a poem from
I
it.
am. It's really a follow-up to Chocolate Buffoons, and the idea is Chocolate Buffoons was lockdown poetry. This is post-lockdown, and it's really inspired by that sense, which I'm sure we all felt, of a combination of relief when lockdown restrictions began to ease at the end of last spring into summer, but also a degree of anxiety about, do we go on holiday? Do I go and watch a football match? Do we go into town? Eating out? And that combination of both joy at being able to do things, but that sense of, is it safe? Am I being right? Will these vaccinations work? So there are a combination of that, plus I'm afraid some more spleen, particularly recently, with all this talk of levelling up, and I've written a poem about Boz's holiday in Marbella when full blown fuel crisis in the UK, and he's off drinking San Miguel in a villa somewhere. So that's the kind of combination of material in the book, and it's called The Level Playing Fields of Eton and Other Poems, which gives you some idea of that. And the one I'm going to read for you is called Turkeys Vote for Christmas, and again, I hope it's topical because it's sort of a news item that I heard fairly recently. So, Turkeys Vote for Christmas. Down in Norfolk, rumours spread, turkeys are all talking. Could it be that just for once by Christmas they'll be walking, not stuffed and sitting on the table? This could be a modern fable. Still alive through circumstance, they might still live. Is there a chance that lack of butchers, drivers too, might mean no Christmas bird for you? While turkeys laugh and stamp their feet. What are you and I to eat? Fish fingers for your crimbo lunch? I should, Coco. Thanks a bunch. We don't want tofu veggie bakes. What a thought, for heaven's sake. So, sort it out, you politicians. Don't put us in that position. You'll find a way. I've got a hunch. Or we'll have bozza for our lunch.
Brilliant, thank you. That's really good, and thanks for coming in today to talk about your poems. Just one question before you go. There will be people listening out there who perhaps want to start to write poetry, like there are always people who say, I've always wanted to write a book. What advice would you give them?
I think it's about being honest, really, and thinking, look, what moves me? What do I remember? What makes me happy? What makes me angry? What do I think about? And not trying to be too complicated. I mean, here's a little list. Poetry doesn't have to be a grand gesture. It doesn't have to rhyme. It doesn't have to appeal to everyone. And if you follow those 3 rules and do what you are interested in and just write down what you think and maybe shape it a little bit afterwards, but just write. I mean, it begins with writing and possibly redrafting, but until you've actually started to write things down, it isn't going to work. And I think I mentioned early on in the interview that one of for me, the easiest things about poetry is it's not a lot of words. It's things that you can draft out very quickly and then revisit, and it's a good way, I think, to get writing if it's something you want to do but don't quite know what form your writing could take.
You've been very generous with your poems in that you put them out into the public domain at a fair rate, I think. I'm right in saying. If people do want to get hold of the hard copies of your book, or your books, sorry, how would they do this?
Well, I do have a website which my son designed and made for me. So if anyone out there wants to buy a book, you can buy them via PayPal on, it's Martyn with a Y, all lowercase, martynpottspoetry.co.uk.
Thanks again for coming in. For those of you who are listening, I would highly recommend that you delve more into Martyn's books. He's a very talented poet, and I always look forward to them being posted on the local social media sites. Thanks again for coming in, and thanks for listening to this edition of Talk of the Heathens.